First, live, local. This is Fox 12 Now.
Hello everyone, this is Fox 12 Now. I'm Greg Nibbler. As always, thank you for joining us. We are live streaming here from the Fox 12 Oregon newsroom, and we start every weekday around 1 o'clock and then go throughout the afternoon covering a wide range of topics. So glad you're here. Don't forget you can share these segments as well afterward. Right now, though, we are going to be talking about Rose City Comic Con, which is imminently coming up here in Portland. We've been doing some coverage of this and some of the great guests that are going to be showing up there, and certainly our guest here, as you can see on the lower third right there, is one of those great guests. I'm talking about Terry Brooks. Big surprise. I put it in there twice.
Sorry.
But
I'm fighting with my mechanics here at this end. They're rebelling against me once more.
That's great. Terry, go ahead. You can play what you figure out whatever you want to do right there. But Terry Brooks joining us, legendary author, Shannara series, and everything else that you have done. Just so many amazing things. Thank you for joining us here on Fox 12 Now.
It's a pleasure. It's nice to be with you.
Well, starting off, I just want to talk about, this illustrious career that you have and how, going back to even the very beginning when you first started, for you, over all this amount of time, has anything changed for you in the way that you write or the way that you interpret and write fantasy and sci-fi? Has anything changed because of maybe technology over that amount of time or the world, or does it still stay pretty true to that genre, how it was when you started?
Funny you should ask that question, because I'm right in the middle of preparing for a class at Rose City Comic Con in which I'm going to talk to the students about that. And the one thing I'm going to tell them that is going to change in their lives if they become a writer is the same thing that happened to me, and that's everything changed. Everything. From starting as a published author in 1977 and up to the present, I can barely think of anything that I started out believing was true, knowing was true, and thinking it's still the same.
Wow, it really has changed that much. So, and that's just
tremendous.
The world around you, or is it because of on a personal level?
Well, it's both, really. I think, for one thing, it's not the same thing to be 30 and then be 80. And, I didn't really realize it until this year. I always thought I was going to function in the same basic way as I always have, and that things would just go along, and I wouldn't be like any of these other people that I see, falling by the wayside. And this year came along, and I tell you, my whole system just kind of shut down and said, no, this is not going to be you anymore. You have to go with the truth of things. The truth is you're 80. And when you're 80, you're not 50 anymore or 30 anymore or anything like that. You're what you are now. So it's been different. And, and the world has changed dramatically too. And in fact, the whole publishing world has changed dramatically so that, I find myself having to learn things all over again. Even the people are different because, so many of the people I grew up with in this business are gone. They're not here anymore. So I'm meeting new authors all the time. And of course, everybody in the whole frickin' world is younger than I am.
It's true, but they do not have the experience that you have and the history of books.
They don't have the experience, but they're going to have a few years on me shortly.
Well, talking about how everything has changed, do you still find yourself, do you read a lot of newer authors?
I do. All the time, in my field, but also in the broader field too. Reading is my passion. So I'm always reading new books by somebody I don't know, as well as following the books of the old authors I've grown to really love and care about. So there's too many choices. I mean, I have too many books. My wife and I are both readers. We have a massive library, and I'm going to die with a whole lot of those books unread because I just can't get to them all.
I mean, it's good to have a lot of options, though.
Oh, yeah. I like having all the options. And I like the fact that I'm constantly finding new writers who inspire me, who I think that their work is so wonderful that I want to call them up and say, I wish I'd written that book.
Wow. Well, I mean, that's a pretty good compliment.
It's a good thing.
Yeah, that's a good compliment coming from you. What in this genre, the genre, the general, I mean, fantasy, sci-fi, I'll just kind of put everything in there. But in that genre of writing and books that people get to read, what is it, do you think, that still draws people to that and is such an attractive, book to read, worlds to get into, that still, to this day is exactly the same kind of people are really drawn to this?
Well, it's storytelling first. That's what drives fantasy fiction, is the storytelling and the tales and the wonder. And we all grow up with some kind of a connection to all of the fables and tales that have been passed down through the years. Frequently, even in children's books, it's some of the first stuff we read before we get to anything else is some kind of fable or fairy tale or children's tale. And then it's such a short jump from there to the more intense adult kinds of forms of fiction that it's an easy step to make, I think.
Are there still children's fairy tales that you can remember that inspired you from way back then? Way back then was a terrible way to phrase that question, but
Let's see.
from when you were a child.
I have to think back about 70 years. Let me see how I can do about that. I don't know. I remember I remember Grimm's fairy tales very well. And in those days, so much was different about the exposure we got and to the different kinds of fiction we got. The intensity of stories in children's fiction back then was pretty light. If I wanted a really serious read in those days, I read Tom Corbett's Space Cadet. Which is nobody today even knows what that is. But anyway, or Lassie. There was always Lassie, or some kind of dog. Or I think I remember really well the fact that for a lot of years in the, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, all I read was dog and horse stories. Because were all those tales that were being written in those days about, the perils and difficulties of dogs and horses and their masters and their caregivers and so forth. And that was the kind of thing you could get into because it wasn't a huge challenge, but it was always exciting.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. I mean, looking at there's always going to be a challenge there.
I mean, you think about it. No Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
No Harry Potter. Nothing that happened back in those days was anything about like what we would think about reading now or what's prevalent in the market now. So it was like, I feel like I was born in a different age entirely. I can still remember my parents talking about World War II as if it happened yesterday. And that's a weird feeling.
Well, for going from those books that you had to reading some of those more modern fantasy books that you just mentioned there,
yes,
in that world and in that kind of fiction, what was that moment for you where you picked up a book? Do you have that? Do you remember that where it was like, okay, this is something different?
Wow,
this is the
let's see. That's hard because I read a lot of different things at different times. I mean, but I started out with the dog and horse stories, Irish Red, Big Red, all of those stories. And then I went in almost immediately into science fiction. In those days, fantasy didn't exist for me. Didn't barely exist at all, but it didn't exist for me. And so I read a lot of science fiction. I read all the old masters, the group that was called themselves the Futurians in those days, Isaac Asimov, Arthur Clarke, Lester Del Rey, all of those people. And then I was enamored of those writers all the way through high school until I got into English classes in a big way. And then I had a whole series of reading, Moby Dick and All Quiet on the Western Front and all of that. And that shifted my whole thinking. But I never really got away from the stories that first enticed me into the field when I came to writing. And I wanted to, first story I ever wrote was a science fiction book. I don't think it was very good, but it was the first thing I ever did. And I can still remember the time and effort I put into it because I wrote, a couple hundred pages of this thing. And in those days, I was writing everything in longhand because I hadn't learned to type yet. So you can imagine how fast that went.
Yeah. Um, that is a that's a lost art now. Um, well, out of all the books, once you did get into it, you got to read your first science fiction book, but getting all of your,
Yeah.
your amazing works that you've done here, is there any particular character that stands out from all of your books that is your favorite to have written and to
Wow. Why don't you just ask me to choose among my children? Uh, well, gosh, I don't know. That's a really tough one. I mean, I like my characters for different reasons. Obviously, the protagonists in all of the books are a personification of my own thinking to a large extent. So I'm close to those characters, but I like the Druids and particularly Al-Anon to a great extent because they are such dark figures, and writing about them is more intensive than some of the other things that I have to do in order to make a story come alive. I like writing about female characters.
Yep.
This is going to sound weird, but I do like writing about female characters. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that I come from a substantially female surrounded background. I had a sister, nobody else. Um, the people I was close to in high school and college and afterwards, and still today, many of them are women. And I feel like I can, to some extent, connect with them yeah, on certain levels, particularly on literary levels, closer than I can with most men.
Interesting. And that's certainly, driven and dictated some of that stuff when it comes to your characters too, then.
Yeah, I think it is. And I always, most of my really strong characters are female. And this is probably some more part of my upbringing. I don't know. But I just like writing about characters that have a lot of passion, a lot of purpose to their lives, struggles that they have to overcome. And to look at the way, I guess because of my exposure on the larger scale to women in my life, I find it easier to write about what I see coming from them than I do. I was never uh, a jock kind of guy. I did sports and stuff, but not to a huge degree. And a lot of what I did was connected with writing and literature and that sort of thing. So the connections were to a large extent female. And it's funny too, because, when I grew up in the field, there were not a whole lot of women writers. Now, this today, we would all die laughing because if you go to the young adult fiction in fantasy, it's like all women. It's like men don't exist except for a very few. So I don't quite know how that came about for me back then because it was a highly male dominated society when you were in high school and so forth, unless you were looking for a date or something.
Well, so something that's definitely changed then, as you mentioned at the beginning, everything's changed. Um,
Mhm.
well, going to that, to the extent for writers now who are starting out, somebody who's
Mhm.
getting into that field, and there are a lot of different avenues to go, but what would be your advice as far as developing their story and getting their novel, their writing out there and actually fully written in the correct way?
Uh, how much time do we have?
30 seconds. No, I'm just kidding.
30 seconds is about right. I don't know. I think if you really want to do writing, you have to devote yourself to it. This isn't something you can do, casually or now and then. You have to do it a lot, and you have to get better at it. And the only way you can do that is you have to practice and practice and practice. And you have to write a lot of crap before you get anything that's any good. Every writer I've talked to has pretty much the same story, unless they are the few, lucky few, who happen to hit it right off the bat. And some of those then suddenly never wrote again. So maybe they burned out on the first book or something. Um, yeah, I think that's important. I think you have to really love books. You got to be wedded to the idea of that as a entertainment form. Uh, if you want to make this a life practice. Um, And you have to have good writing habits. You have to commit yourself.
Very good. Yeah, so these are all things that people should be thinking about too for all those younger writers out there,
They want to be writers.
Yeah, that's the way to do it. Well, for you coming here for Rose City Comic Con, you're obviously going to have your panel. And what is it like for you to still be, just to go out to these events, and see people who have been affected by your writing, who are fans of what you've put out there over these years, over all those books,
Oh,
and then
when
interacting with them?
you mean when I'm not wondering what's wrong with them? Uh, I think, I admire their enthusiasm. I'm appreciative, obviously, of the intensity with which they greet my books. I think I'm always astounded that they like my books better than I do. And that they get so enamored of everything, and they want to know all about how did you do this? How did you do that? Why did you do this? That sort of thing. And a lot of the times I'm thinking, let's see, what book was that? What was I thinking, 50 years ago? Yeah, so but the passion of readers always engages me. And to see it with people who read my books is very rewarding.
That's great. Yeah, and people who it really is. Maybe you may not remember what it was, but they remember.
They do.
Yep, remember every moment. Well, Terry, thank you, very much for having some time to talk to us today, to joining us.
Good talking to you, Greg. And I'll be looking forward to Rose City.
Yeah, absolutely. Rose City Comic Con coming
Okay.
up. Well, Terry, we'll see you there.
Coming up in less than 2 weeks. Thank you. Good
All right.
talking to you.
Yeah, you too. And for everybody who's watching live, again, this is Fox 12 Now. We cover a lot of topics here throughout the afternoon. We're going to take a break. We're going to come back here in about a few minutes, actually, and we're going to be talking about switching gears. I said a wide range of topics, so it's back to school time. We're going to talk about cybersecurity. So I've got a cybersecurity expert coming on to talk about how you can make sure that you're staying safe, something that we're covering a lot here at Fox 12 Oregon. And so again, that's at 1:30, whatever platform you're on. Join me right back there. I'll talk to you then. I'm Greg Nibbler. This is Fox 12 Now.